You are listening to a Difference for One podcast, episode number 26.
I'm Michelle.
I'm Nicole.
I'm Charisse.
And I'm Cami.
We are the English sisters.
We come together to share life-changing methods of improvement through a variety of topics.
We hope that above all, these discussions will help you feel that Jesus Christ is making a difference for you, the one. And we also hope that our podcast will inspire you to find simple ways that you can make a difference for one.
Hi, friends. Today we want to talk about a concept we call hedging. But before we explain what that means, let's go back to the thought cycle episode where we talked about the field of perception. It starts with the thought cycle, which is thought, emotion, effort, and outcome. This relates to a tree with a seed, trunk, branches, and fruit. The tree is within our field of perception. If you remember, each of us has an imaginary field or garden, however you want to imagine it. And we have the soil, sun, and rain feeding the plants and trees that live within our field. Remember, the soil represents validation and support. The sun is the savior, or whatever spiritual nourishment looks like for you. And the rain is affirmations. There may be other things that you could add that contribute to the nourishment of your trees and plants, but these are just some examples. Okay, your field of perception is how you view the world, and it's all about what you're feeding your mind and body. What outside influences are you allowing to shape your perception? This is going to look different for every person. It's important to note that what this field looks like has a lot to do with what was formed as a young child, with a lot contributing to it. Some examples of those contributions might be your personality, how you were treated as a child, how you behaved, and other people's reactions to those behaviors. Each of us four sisters could say that we grew up in a completely different situation, even though we all grew up in the same home, because of those varying aspects of our personalities and behaviors and things like that.
We'll be back after this quick break with a message from our sponsors. Okay, so how does hedging relate to all of this? Well, we want you to imagine a hedge surrounding the field of perception. The definition of a hedge is a fence or a boundary formed by closely growing bushes or shrubs. So picture this hedge in your mind surrounding your field. It could be tall, blocking everything outside of it, or maybe short, where you can see beyond without stepping outside it. It could be overbearing and suffocating, like you're stuck in a closed maze, or it could be widespread and you barely even notice that it's there.
I actually like those examples, Nicole. As I was thinking of them while you were talking, I was thinking if you had a tall hedge around the outside of your garden or your field of perception, I would think of it as being like not wanting to face your problems, something that you can't really see, something that is an issue that you're wanting to ignore, maybe purposefully, but it's still subconscious.
Yeah, I like that.
And then maybe like a short hedge would be a boundary that you decided to create, but you still can see over it. Maybe the suffocating ones that are overbearing might be addictions, things that are dragging you down and that are hindering your lifestyle choices. And maybe the widespread one that's on the very outskirts of your edge would be the simple things that you don't really think that you're doing, but you're still doing, like checking your phone during the day. Any of these hedges could also be false pleasures. We call them hedges because they block our view of being able to see the world as it really is and finding lasting true happiness. The difference between true happiness and false pleasures is that one is an underlying sense of contentment in our lives, mixed with the hope of heavenly days, when all will be set right and problems of this world will melt away. When we view the world with no hedges, we can anticipate the future and live in the moment with clear, all-seeing eyes. Hedging, on the other hand, is seeking those false pleasures that are quick, fast, releasing, and keep us coming back for more because we want it more and more. But if you think about that hedge, it blocks things up. We only see what's right in front of us, and the more we seek for those false pleasures and the more false they are, the higher and thicker that hedge becomes until eventually it chokes out all the natural goodness, the sun, the soil, and the rain. We don't recognize the soil, sun, and rain for the goodness that they are, or they don't become as important for us to seek because we become so fixated on what that hedge is doing for us.
Yeah, and hedging has two different manifestations. There's physical and emotional. Both are really a way to hide from our true situation, our thoughts, our emotions. We're trying to run away from the situation, but we can't because it's within ourselves. So we put up a wall or a hedge so that we can't see it anymore, even though it's always there. It's a way for us to pretend that the problem isn't there anymore. So some examples of hedges might be drugs, alcohol, pornography, caffeine, overeating, overspending, overworking, spending time on our phones or social media, binge watching shows on Netflix. Really, the possibilities are endless. But the reason that it's a false pleasure is because it's a way of pretending that the problem isn't there or shutting things out that you don't want to deal with at the moment. The problem is that the issue will come back up magnified later on. It could be something as simple as scrolling through Pinterest because it gives you a false sense of creating things without having to put the work into actually creating them. We get a similar feeling, but in the end, we know that we didn't actually create anything. Or maybe drinking to forget problems for a while, but they'll still be there the next day, but with a hangover added onto them. I think a good indication that it's hedging is when the thought of not doing that thing is painful, and hedging usually has negative consequences. So the opposite of that would be, for example, if the idea of not showering is painful to you, that's a good thing, you should shower. But if the idea of not having a bowl of ice cream after dinner every day is painful to you, it's a good indication that you could be hedging. The good news, though, is that you get to decide for yourself in what areas of your life you're hedging. I've been thinking lately about the difference between joy and self-indulgence. If you are being true to yourself and frequently evaluating your life, you'll be able to truly figure out what things in your life are bringing you joy and which things you're using as an escape not to focus on core problems. And keep in mind that the things that bring you joy can turn into hedging if you're not careful. And I also think that indulgence is okay as long as you're aware of it and decide to do it consciously. If it has a positive impact on your life rather than detracting from your ultimate goals, it can be beneficial. Say you're going all day long and you crave a night of binging Netflix with your husband, you can plan that out and decide you're going to watch 3 episodes of something or whatever it is, but it becomes hedging when you mindlessly scroll through knowing that you should be doing something else and you're basically working against your own will.
So a lot of times when we are hedging, we are actually avoiding a lot of stressful situations. And I just want to quickly explain what goes on in the body physiologically when we have stress. And for the sake of easement, I will call it survival mode. When a stressful situation occurs, the body will naturally go into survival mode in order to handle that stress. Physiologically, certain systems in the body will stop during that time so that a lot of the body's energy can go toward what it needs to do to survive. The body will sort out which systems take priority for the best results. For example, if I were to come into contact with a bear, the adrenaline in my body will surge and I will go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. My body will quickly figure out how to survive this situation. When that happens, other systems are not the priority shut down, like the digestive system and the reproductive system. Those systems will stop in the body. So that's a reason why when I personally am stressed, my stomach just stops. It clogs up because the digestive system stops. It's not a priority when it comes to survival. It's not very common for me to come into contact with a bear, but it is common for me to get into stressful situations. The body handles stress the same way, whether it is live or die type of circumstance. With this information, I can tell my mind that just because I am faced with a difficult situation doesn't mean that I can't handle it. But if I choose to ignore the problem instead of facing it and hoping it goes away, it actually won't go away. It becomes a hedge. It doesn't make us good or bad when we do this. It's just something that happens within our human nature.
And even though it doesn't make us good or bad, it's still something that isn't very good for us. And so that's why we're talking about how we can get rid of our hedges or face our problems in a healthy way.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out the significance of dopamine and our brains creating neural pathways, making up our habits, which are often the kinds of hedges we are talking about. So our brains are wired to keep us alive for survival, as Charisse was talking about. The animal instinct within us forms these pathways, the neural pathways I mentioned, like creating highways in our brains starting at a very young age. The brain takes note of what actions we take to get what's called a dopamine hit or a happy surge, and what actions to avoid because it didn't get the result we wanted in the end. Dopamine is there to keep us safe and motivated to get the things that are good for our survival. But the problem is that hit of dopamine readily comes with false pleasures, oftentimes. The brain fires and says, "That was good. I need that to survive and be happy. Do what it takes to get more of that." get it, get it. And outside people looking in could look at something like pornography as an addiction that is a disgusting habit or a false pleasure because their brain has not created a hedge in that area blocking their view and focusing solely on how to get more of that. Pornography is to a Twinkie like sex in a healthy relationship is to an apple. The brain has that surge of intense processed sugar that makes the sweetness of an apple less and less enticing the more Twinkies you eat. Your brain creates that neural pathway so that all the brain can think about is getting those Twinkies, and other things outside of that become less important. Get the Twinkie, get more Twinkies is what your brain is saying to you. As you recognize that you want to cut out the Twinkies and seek for the apples of life, your brain wants to resist. It wants to do what's easy and knows will bring the desired effect. So if you want to change this, you'll have to create new neural pathways or natural pleasures to replace the false ones by doing the same thing every day to take its place and train your brain to redefine what is good and worthy of seeking. This is done much better if you can form these good habits and get the dopamine in natural ways from a young age. Things like keeping a gratitude journal, learning about the world in new ways, playing games with family. Those are healthy, positive ways to seek pleasure. If we don't form those habits while we're young, that doesn't mean we can't change as we get older. It just takes more effort. You know that old saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks? It's not actually true, but it's like paving a new road rather than using the road that has always been traveled in the past.
Yeah, I think it's important to be curious about our brain and our thoughts within the brain. Sometimes we may need to take the time to observe what our brain is doing from an outsider's perspective. Recognize what is going on in your mind and what you're feeling, but try to do this without reprimanding yourself or feeling bad about it. Just observe yourself so you can understand where you're coming from and why you may be hedging with this or that. Then determine if it's something that you want to cut out completely or just cut back a little bit on.
Yeah, in the same way that you don't want to be too hard on yourself, it's also important to remember that we only need to focus on ourselves and our own hedging and not on what anyone else is doing. It's really easy for us to see how others might be hedging and to determine what we think they need to do to change, but it's not as easy to see how we're doing it ourselves. So when you pick out something that someone needs to do to stop hedging, that's just your opinion. Only you can know if you're hedging. No one else can tell you that you're hedging because hedging is a way to escape your problems or stressors, and so only you can recognize whether you're doing that. The other day in one of my mommy groups on Facebook, I saw that a woman was talking about how her husband is on his phone all the time, and it was really frustrating for her. And so I was just thinking that it would be really easy for us to say, oh yeah, he was probably hedging. And while I do think that could be helpful as long as you're using it as a way to give him a little grace, like to say, he's probably using this as a way to hedge, and then you're coming from a place of understanding instead of judging. But if you say, oh no, you're hedging, you need to stop this, then that's not good. And so give other people grace when you see them hedging and realize they are using this as a way to comfort themselves and trying to find a way to not have to face their problems, and use that as a way to have sympathy for them or compassion. But when you're looking at yourself, you can recognize your own hedging and find ways to change it so that you're facing your problems and resolving them, or letting yourself sit with your problems and still be okay, instead of just throwing up those walls that the hedges build around your field of perception. Like we said, it's really easy to see what someone else is doing rather than seeing what you're doing that needs to change. And this reminded me of Matthew chapter 7, where Christ is saying, why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? So keep in mind that a mote that you're beholding in someone else's eye, a mote is just a little splinter. It's a really tiny piece of wood. And a beam is more like a 2x4. So Christ is saying, why are you focusing so much on a little tiny piece of wood or a little tiny problem with your neighbor or whoever, your spouse or your friend, your sister, whatever? And you're not even considering that you have this huge beam that's making you blind to your own problem. So it's really important that we have compassion on others when we notice that they're hedging or think they could be hedging, and we recognize our own hedging and focus on that and just keep that tunnel vision and try to work on our own shortcomings. Because we all have ways that we hedge. No one is completely free of hedges. If they are, it's because they are consistently working every day on clearing them out, and that takes a lot of effort. And even then, they can still come back or they can come in other ways. So it's a daily process to work on this. Just focus on clearing your own hedges and let others clear their own. So with that said, we thought it would be cool if we each went through a way that we hedge. This is Nicole. I'll go first. One way that I hedge is I avoid talking to people. In a previous episode, I talked about how I have anxiety and possibly OCD. The way that I usually experience what I think is OCD is feeling nervous all the time and anxious a lot about what I say to other people or how I interact with them that could be hurting their feelings or offending them, or things I could be saying wrong or whatever. And I will, in my mind, think of things that they might be thinking about me that I'm doing wrong or that I'm doing that are offensive. When I have a bad day, I will start to avoid talking to people so that I don't have to worry about it anymore. So that's one way of hedging, because I'm putting up that high hedge so that I don't have to look at my problems, don't have to deal with my problems, don't have to change myself and be better or try to just sit with what is. And I'll just kind of get in my own little hole and only talk to my kids. Cami, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so one thing I do to hedge often is sleeping. I'm in college right now, and I can stay up late to the ends of the earth if I'm doing something that feels fun to me. But as soon as I have a big assignment that's due or something that I feel like is more of a responsibility, I am suddenly so tired and I have to go to sleep right that second. And it has been a real problem for me in the past because I get sloppy with my assignments and I end up feeling frazzled, and I don't feel peaceful as I'm going throughout my semesters. So that's one way that I often avoid my problems, and it's something I'm still working on. A lot of times when I get home from work, I feel like the most important thing is for me to take a nap before I do other homework, but then things always come up and it gets harder and harder to finish. Hopefully, using these skills that we've talked about with taking something that is hedging in our minds and replacing it with a positive habit, hopefully that will help me to be able to overcome it.
So this is Cherie speaking. My thing that I hedge with is when I'm tired at the end of the day, I just sometimes want to eat a snack. And I don't want to process all the emotional baggage that I dealt with during the day, mostly from parenting my children. So sometimes I choose to just ignore that and eat ice cream or something sweet. I'm not really a savory person. I'm more of a sweet person. I know everybody's different. And I decided a couple days ago, maybe this was yesterday, I've just been thinking about this, of maybe a hack of how I can tackle my hedging with something sweet, is that whenever I have a craving for something sweet, I have decided my new thing is to sit and meditate for like a minute or two and just try to be present with whatever I'm feeling and take some deep breaths, because I know that the important thing is that I need to address the core issue in the moment instead of ignoring it. And even if that core issue is a pile of issues and it feels like emotional baggage at the end of the day, I have meditated in the past and I have found success in my own life with meditating and breathing and just trying to be present. And so I'm hoping that after I'm done meditating, I won't need the snack anymore, but maybe if I still do and I've processed that, then I will address it after that and try to just be consciously aware. Okay, Michelle, you're last.
So when I know the best thing for my family is to have true connection and do something fun, like play games together or talk together, make some good family memories, I know that that's what I want to do, is to build those lasting relationships. But then a lot of times I get lazy and just say, let's just all watch a movie together, because it doesn't take effort or brain work. And then another thing I do is when I'm in a bad mood and I want to escape those negative feelings, especially if it's like something really like a hectic part of my day, I will try to tune everything out and just turn on a podcast or a YouTube video or an audiobook and try to block everyone out around me. Okay, you're going to think this is nerdy. I know, but I will oftentimes listen to Dave Ramsey. I'll be like, what is going to make me happy? Listening to Dave Ramsey. And so I turn him on and listen to him while I am feeding the kids lunch, for instance, because it makes me happy when really I should be engaging with the kids and building those relationships and fully involved in what's going on there. And so that's something that I've tried to make a conscious effort to listen to podcasts or audiobooks when I'm by myself. Maybe if I'm cleaning or something and the kids are off doing school or other activities, then I can take that time by myself. But when they're there and when I should be interacting with them, to make that focus be on them instead of trying to escape that.
So maybe some of you audience members have been thinking about, oh, in what ways do I hedge, or when do I ever do hedging in my life? And maybe some of you haven't figured it out yet. So I want to explain another thing that has to do with hedging that will maybe help you decide or figure out if you've maybe done this before. Sometimes when we have a hedge up around our field of perception, it may feel like we have a wall around our heart. I'm sure you've heard of putting up a wall. We often do this to protect ourselves or when we feel misunderstood, hurt, unloved, or untrusting, thinking it will somehow protect us from getting hurt. But in reality, putting that wall up keeps us from really connecting with other people. And if we let something someone else does bother us, that will most likely happen whether we have that wall up around our heart or not. Often people have walls up to protect their hearts because they've really been hurt in the past and they don't want to get hurt again. So much of who we are is formed when we are children. So if you've grown up in a dysfunctional family of any kind, you can carry that far into adulthood, and it takes time to trust and break down those barriers again. And your family doesn't necessarily have to be dysfunctional, but just maybe not honoring you as a person. I don't know. That's just an example. But the longer that we block an experience or an emotion or even somebody out of our lives, the thicker the wall will get and the harder it will be to break that down. And that wall is the hedge.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, so you are putting up walls when you're not wanting to process or sit through uncomfortable feelings. So just to reiterate one solution to hedging, you can start by looking at what you want to change or weed out. And you can decide whether you want to do less of that thing or get rid of it altogether. And as you said earlier, the key to changing a negative habit that you want gone completely is to replace it with something positive. So predetermine what you're going to use as a healthy replacement and then stick with it. For example, if you like treats after dinner like I do, you can decide you're going to eat one cookie rather than however many you're feeling in the moment. Or set aside 20 minutes of Netflix on Mondays and Wednesdays rather than allowing yourself to watch it any moment you feel stressed throughout the week.
So, of course, you guys know by now that we have to end on a spiritual note. We wanted to talk about how we can build barriers not just between us and other people in our lives, but also between us and God. When we started to talk about this as we were thinking about what we would say in this episode, what came to my mind was the prodigal son, because he took his inheritance and left his father to go spend his money in riotous living, it says in the scriptures. And I thought of this as a way for him to hedge, that he didn't want to face whatever problems he had at home, and instead he just wanted to live it up and do whatever he wanted and put up those barriers instead of facing life. So we do something similar to that with God. When we feel like we aren't worthy to grow closer to Him, we can tend to, or at least I think I probably do this sometimes. You might just be like, forget it all. I'm just gonna go crazy. And that's a way of hedging. We're going to talk about this in a future episode in more detail, but one reason that we put up barriers between ourselves and God is because we're feeling shame. Shame means that we feel that we are bad, whereas guilt, or what we also might call godly sorrow, is knowing that you did something bad. So the difference is shame, I am bad. Guilt or godly sorrow, I did a bad thing, or I did something I shouldn't have.
The good news is that God is always there to catch us and help us get past our mistakes and overcome our weaknesses. Remember that He comes to us where we are right now. Obedience to God's commandments is not about a checklist or earning our way into heaven, because we would never be able to do it, but it's about where our hearts are at. The more we read scriptures and pray and do those things that connect us to God, the more our hearts are softened and turned to Him. And as our hearts are softened, we recognize the barriers that need to come down with relation to ourselves, our relationship to God, and to other people. Thanks so much for listening, guys. Talk to you next time.
If you like this podcast, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. If it resonates with you, the greatest compliment you could give is to share it with a friend who might benefit from it as well. Check out A Difference for One on Instagram for additional content. And if you have any questions, comments, a topic you'd like to hear about, or if you'd be interested in a free mini coaching session, send an email to adifferenceforone@gmail.com.